Then we shift gears to demographics. Demographics is the opposite of economics in that it's the easiest thing to forecast because every year we all get 1 year older. So we have a pretty good idea, at least from an age perspective, what we're going to be facing. We can predict that out. I mean, the biggest variable in this section is immigration. Again, I seem to be touching all the political hot buttons today, but that's the biggest uncertainty in demographics. So, and I know this may sound kind of high level as we get to talking about the sales force, but I promise I'll bring it back down into more nuts and bolts as to what it means for your sales force as we go through this. The good news about population growth is that the US population is going to increase by about 8%, not per year, but 8% by 2025. Big unknown there is immigration, as I said. The bad news is the rate of increase is declining. So just to throw a graph at you, you see the population increasing. I'm not expecting you to read it or anything. I'm just trying to show you the population is expected to increase at a fairly steady rate, but instead of, if you read the numbers on the right, which you can't, it's going to go from about 0.8% per year down to around 0.7, which in demographic terms is it's pretty significant decline in the rate of increase. Economists love to do that. Declines in the rates of increase. But yeah, so we're increasing but at a slower rate. The other thing that's impossible to see on the chart, but that I want to tell you is a little more than half of the increase is from immigration. The other half is from natural growth of the population. So half, so that's a big part. So depending on what happens, if we let more people in, if we let fewer people in, and obviously it translates to do they have skills as electricians and things like that, but also do they generate income that generates business, that they get jobs, they pay taxes, and they need more homes and they're going to work in factories. So that is, as I said, that's the biggest unknown in this section of demographics is what happens with immigration because it's half of all the increase. So that's on the size of the population. I think much more relevant or much more impactful is we're actually in the middle of a generation gap. We've got baby boomers retiring. Last year, millennials that cohort became bigger than the baby boomers for the first time. The gap is Gen X, Generation X. So you can actually see this in this chart here with the little red arrow. There are not enough Gen Xers to replace the retiring baby boomers. So I'm going to discuss millennials in just a second. But the issue here is you've got baby boomers retiring, so at all levels, at end customers, at contractors, in your business, at your suppliers, and they're taking a lot of experience and skills with them. Estimating jobs, specifying, having contacts. You've got a great salesperson retiring and they've got tremendous contacts throughout the contractor base or the end customer base. And is there a Gen Xer who's just 10 years younger and they're building up those? Or do you have a millennial who's 20 years younger and doesn't have those skills or those contacts? And it's more likely the latter. And I'm sure everybody's story here varies because you're not the overall economy, your individual companies, and maybe you found people to replace your retiring baby boomers. And so some of the variables that we look at here are baby boomers retiring or sliding into retirement? Are they going to work part-time? Are millennials using technology to build their skills more rapidly? But I think the net is that there's a generation gap. And one of the challenges is going to be, can we use innovation or technology to fill that gap? Or are you going to have a sales force that's going to have some issues? And if you have issues, again, as I said, what are you going to do about that? And so part of this is going to be dependent on the millennial generation. I'm going to talk about that in a slide. But one of the other factors that we need to consider is something called the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is the ratio between people who aren't in the workforce to people who are in the workforce. So you've got people who are young, they're children, they're kids, they're students, they're not working. Now, if you have college kids, maybe they got a part-time job if you can convince them to go out and work, but they're not working. And you've got senior citizens and people who are retired. And what's the ratio of those people to everyone else? And that ratio is, no surprise, going up. So the ratio was around 6 people who aren't working for every 10 who are, and that's going up to 7.5 people. This is the whole issue with Social Security, et cetera. So this relates back to the economy again. So if the dependency ratio goes up, it's a drag on the economy, which means maybe we don't have as robust an economy. And that's actually one of the reasons that economists are forecasting modest growth is the dependency ratio. So that's one thing we need to look out for. But again, it's also a symptom or another indicator of the generation gap I just talked about. That could lead to very big problems for us at different levels in terms of labor shortages. So these could be labor shortages at the customer level, say the contractors, and you even see here a quote from National Association of Home Builders saying, and I think this was about a year ago, so bad as to call it an epidemic. So we're going to likely see some of these shortages that we saw a year ago. So this is data from contractors, and it said red is serious shortages and blue here is some shortage. And carpenters were 16% serious shortage and 58%. Again, the data is a little bit old, so this data it's going to go up and down over time. So with carpenters, as building picked back up after 2008, 2009, by 2015, you had almost 70% of contractors saying they couldn't get subcontractors in rough carpentry. Electricians, it was 8 and 40, so almost half of the general contractors were saying they had problems finding people. Now again, that's going to go up and down, it's going to be sporadic. We're certainly seeing a lot in trucking, for example. So until self-driving trucks get here, we're going to have a problem. Did you see that they had the first experiment with self-driving trucks? I thought it was great. It was a load of Budweiser beer going 200 miles down the road. Perfect. We're talking about self-driving trucks and it's beer. But yeah, till that gets here, there's going to be spot shortages off and on. And so from a Salesforce perspective, that's going to be an economic challenge. You might even have spot shortages in your Salesforce. Because again, we talked about that Gen X gap. You may find somebody retires and you can't find a capable person to replace them, or at least for a while. So labor shortages or gaps either among your customers or in your Salesforce are going to be a challenge. So then we get to millennials. So I mentioned earlier that with this Gen X gap, there are several solutions. One, as I said, is put more on your website. Tell your customer, look, I don't have obviously you wouldn't say this to your customers, but I've got a lot of retirees in my Salesforce, the great people I had, or in my estimators, et cetera. They're not here. I'm training my millennials. They haven't built up their skill sets yet, so go to my website because I've got some tools you could use. Now again, that's not the way you say it to your customer, but in effect, that could be a strategy. The other strategy, of course, is to try and bring your millennials up to speed a lot more quickly, or combine the two. To get them up to speed more quickly, give them more technology tools to supplement their own individual knowledge. So, get an estimating app that they can use, and that, you literally suck the skills out of your retirees before they go and you put them in this app. And when I get to the technology section, that's one of the things I'll talk about is some of these apps. But there are challenges with dealing with millennials, and I guess I don't want to say the good news. The good news is millennials are very similar to Gen Xers and even baby boomers in the sense that pay is the number one thing that all three of those generations care about first and foremost. So I guess we're human beings, and we need to eat and everything else. But beyond that, you see a number of big differences. First of all, a lot of the millennials have taken on significant debt, school debt, or healthcare or other things, but particularly school debt. And so they're a little bit nervous about that. So when I talk about compensation in a few slides, we'll see how that factors in. But the biggest differences are that millennials have a much bigger thought about balancing work and their private lives, about flexibility in their hours, about having a sense of purpose and contributing to society. Recent surveys show that most millennials are actually thinking of leaving their jobs in the next couple of years because they don't feel like they're getting those things. Millennials, depending on what you read and everything, and I don't want to put down millennials because I think kids are actually doing great work, but they've been handheld a lot. They expect to get promoted quickly based on merit. It doesn't matter what my age is. They're perhaps overestimating what they know, but they think they should get promoted more quickly. And so as we talk about the scenarios, all of that's going to filter down into what we need to do for the sales force. So I don't want to draw conclusions quite yet, but it says if we have a Generation X gap, if the economy is humming along at a modest rate, even just a modest rate, let alone if we can find some scenario where it ticks up, you've got a lot of demand, you've got retiring baby boomers, and you don't have an experienced sales force or estimating force, et cetera, to deal with that demand. And and the people you have, the millennials that you can put into that role, don't have the skills, and they're very demanding of you in a different way. So I know, Scott, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I was talking with Scott before the presentation, and we were talking about millennials and how they want to progress quickly and everything else. Would you mind for a second, Scott, just talking about the thing you did? I thought that was interesting.
What Bob and I were talking about was that a couple of years ago at one of these meetings and a presentation, I took away from it that the millennials want to see progression through the training process. So we set up workstations for 3 to 5 weeks to start in one spot, move to another, and progress for 3 to 4 months. And every person who has experienced that had been very happy with the experience.
Yeah. So the idea is that they can see progression, they feel a sense of purpose, I'm building my skills, I'm contributing. And so that's one of the things you might want to think about, and is this, okay, it's an electrical distribution business. How do I reframe that in a sense of not only progression, but a sense of purpose? And so, you want to talk about things like we are helping build the future. So we're building housing for people maybe who, lower income housing, or we are building, skyscrapers that are going to house the, that are going to be the future business of the country. Or, we're getting into, some of these automated factories or smart cities. So you might think of your business as more prosaic. We're selling cable and circuit breakers and stuff. But I think for your millennials, you want to reframe it in a much bigger sense of purpose and some of the other things, flexibility, progression through jobs, et cetera. And that is one way that you can help your millennials, A, stick around, and B, help deal with the gap that there aren't as many Gen Xers as we need. The last thing, which I don't think is any big surprise to people, is we've got changing composition of the workforce. It's just going to be more diverse. I mean, we've heard about diversity for, 5-10 years now, but the data is very real. I mean, particularly around the red is Hispanic in this chart here below, but the big change really is in the Hispanic population, and certainly with electrical distributors, you see this in your own sales organization, you certainly see it in contractors. And again, without stepping on the third rail of immigration policy, regardless, I mean, you're going to have to deal with both customers and salespeople and, build diversity into your sales organization, not only because it's a good thing to do, but from a practical business perspective, you're going to have a lot more customers either owned by or where the employees are particularly Hispanic. And not that they're any different than any other customer, but, you're going to need to relate to them. And so you need to look at your own sales force to be able to relate to them. Doesn't mean a Hispanic person has to sell to a Hispanic person. You just got to understand your customer base, and it's changing. And your sales force needs to adapt to that as well. So conclusions here. Again, this will feed the scenarios at the end of the presentation. Is that there's going to be considerable shifts, or likely will be considerable shifts in the makeup. So we talked about what's the mix of the sales force. So in terms of race or ethnicity, gender, but certainly age is probably, the millennial thing is probably the biggest thing here. You're going to need to look at the composition of the sales force, and from a skills perspective, you need to replace the skills and experience of the baby boomers. Those are the big things driving from the demographics, the scenarios.